You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. What do having a cheerful face, obeying a king, and not being able to predict the future have in common? Stumped? Well, if you are in good company, because so was I through pretty much the entire time I was trying to study this chapter, because those are all topics that come up in this short chapter of Ecclesiastes 8. But we had an 11th hour miracle, quite literally last night as I was wrapping up some study for this right before I had to record. I came across some information that I think totally changes my understanding of this passage, and I believe it will do the same for you as well. So, what I thought was going to be a really basic chapter, just a rehash of some traditional wisdom that we had talked about before in the book, is completely turned on its head into a very complex but fascinating chapter to study. So I can't wait to get into this. I guarantee it will blow your mind. So here we go. Ecclesiastes chapter 8, Uncut and Unfiltered. Before we even get started going through the chapter this week, I want to challenge you, if at all possible, to just take a minute and read through this chapter yourself, because there is so much in this chapter that you kind of need to just have it in front of you to be able to follow along with what I'm talking about, that I think it would help to just have an idea of what is being said before we get into any of it. So if you are able to, obviously if you're driving or something like that, you might want to put this on hold for a little bit, but I would say give this a pause right now and just read through chapter 8. It is super short. It's only 17 verses. I have it right up here in front of me in the computer, and I don't even have to scroll. I can see the whole chapter. So it's short. I'm not going to say it's an easy read because it's pretty confusing what exactly is going on. But go ahead and read it, and then think about what comes to mind as some key elements of this chapter. Like, as you read through it, what do you perceive to be the main topics, the main issues at hand here? All right, so we're doing homework at the beginning of class. We're reversing the schedule here. I'm going to give you a second, read through it. I'll give you a chance to pause here and just consider what you think are the main topics or talking points in this chapter. Anything that stands out to you. All right, go ahead and pause. Oh, back so soon. You didn't read it, did you? I'm just kidding. I don't know if you actually did or not. But before we now get into the chapter, let's talk about what you had stand out. Like, what to you maybe seemed a little bit different about this chapter or seemed like a key idea? I'll tell you, for myself, when I first read this, I noticed that there was a lot about a royal court. That's a new setting and a new series of topics for us. This has pretty much been general wisdom, but he's now at this point, Qoheleth is speaking to people who are going to be in the presence of royalty. And obviously that's not most people. So he's speaking to an elite group about something that's going to be a very niche issue because, most people in the ancient world didn't ever get to see the king, let alone talk to him in his court. So this is going to be a little bit of a shift in focus from anything we've had so far. I also noticed kind of a weird shift in tone in the second half of the chapter. Did any of you see that? Where he gives this very conventional, traditional sounding wisdom about fearing God, and I know that it's not going to end up well for the wicked, but it's going to end up well for those who fear God. And it just, I don't know, it struck me as completely different than the message that Qoheleth has been giving us throughout this entire book so far. So, is that anything that stood out to you? Was there anything else? Obviously, I can't hear you, but you can comment in the socials for the episode, and you can write in on our website. You can email us at cconn@thebibleuncut.com. Let us know, what were your initial thoughts going in this? What do you think this chapter is about? And I keep asking that this week because whatever you think this chapter is about, it's probably not actually quite about that. I mean, we get the idea of the royal court, we get the idea of fearing God at the end. There's definitely a lot of talk of power, but how exactly that all connects together is weird. And this is what I was talking about in the intro. We see him talking about having a cheery countenance or expression on your face. He talks about obeying a king. He talks about not being able to know the future, and just what in the world is all of that? How does it all tie together? That's the mystery that we have to unravel today. And so this is going to be a little bit of a different episode, at least here in the beginning. It's not just going to be me going verse by verse, but rather I'm going to kind of walk you through this process of how I tried to figure this out, partially just because that's how I made sense of it. And then also, I think this can be a good way to share some Bible study techniques for you for when there's a passage that is really difficult to understand. Like, if you can walk through this with me, hopefully I won't just be teaching you about Ecclesiastes 8, but also bringing you on a journey of how to get to the bottom of difficult passages. So before we get into any of the actual interpretation, we have to just talk about what's starting off this chapter here. The word biblical commentary has pointed out that the general theme of this chapter is authority, both human and divine. And they break it up into basically four sections. They say the first four verses are an instruction concerning conduct before a king. The next four verses are about divine authority and the human reaction to that. Then verses 9 through 15 are about the abuse of authority, and the final two verses are about the human inability to know what God is doing. They also point out that now that we are in the second half of the book, the first two chapters of the second half, so last week's material, chapter 7, this week's chapter 8, they deal with what humans are unable to find out about life. But then the second half of the second half, chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 6, deals with what will happen in the future that humans can't figure out. So this chapter 7, chapter 8 are kind of like stuff in the present that's hard to understand, and then the next three chapters are going to be things in the future that are hard to understand. So that's an interesting way to break it down. Looking just at the first verse, though, commentators debate whether this verse fits best with the previous chapter's thoughts or with this chapter's thoughts. Now, remember, originally no Bible book had chapter or verse divisions. They were added in much later, just as a way for us to better read the text more smoothly. You know, no one wants to be going through something the size of Isaiah and saying, okay, find where he says this, right? It's going to take us a while to get there. So it's a lot easier to say, turn to Isaiah 6, verse 10, yeah, whatever it may be. So it is always possible that our English chapter and verse divisions might not make sense compared to the flow of the texts. We've talked about this before, where sometimes the chapter and verse divisions between English and Hebrew or Greek don't even line up, because over the years people have thought differently about how thoughts flow in these different books. That's why I actually like, if you're dealing with, I was going to say a physical copy of the Bible, but there are some digital copies that do this too, where they break up the Bible's text into paragraphs. You know, if you grew up with the Bible or have used it for a while, it probably seems totally natural to you to have a line for every verse, right? You have verse 1 on a line, verse 2 is a separate line, verse 3 is a separate line, verse 4. But there is literally nothing else that we read like that, aside from, I don't know, maybe a menu or something like that. So there are certain editions of the Bible that will format it in paragraph form to try to follow the flow of thought instead of just chapters and verses. And I really like that. It can really improve your Bible study and help you follow the flow of thought beyond just chapter and verse. So that's something to look into if you've never tried reading a paragraph style Bible. But let's get back here to verse 1 and figuring out where the heck it belongs. Because some of what it's talking about, like who is a wise man, who knows the interpretation of a thing, that fits a little bit with what he talked about last week. Verse 23 of chapter 7 says, all this I have proved by wisdom. I said I'll be wise, but it ended up being far from me. So he's talking about wisdom at the end of the chapter there. But then verse 1 also talks about, you know, making his face to shine or having a brightened or boldened countenance. And there's a lot about face showing up in this chapter. That's kind of a key word that keeps getting repeated before someone's face, in front of someone's face, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Believe me, that is going to come up more as we go along here. But there's things that could connect it to either the previous chapter or this current one. In fact, there was even a couple of commentaries I looked at that suggested dividing the verse in half, with the first half of chapter 8, verse 1 going with chapter 7, and the second half of chapter 8, verse 1 going with chapter 8. It's a bit unnecessary, but the more I looked at it, I can actually see how someone might think that way. But personally, the more I've looked at this, I think it makes sense to keep this as part of the thought of chapter 8. Regardless of what you think about, though, it is very much a hinge between these two chapters. And much like with last week, we have to think about, in this chapter, whether Qoheleth is presenting wisdom he agrees with or scrutinizing common aphorisms and suggesting that maybe they aren't actually as true as prevailing thought of the day would have it. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, I suggest you go back. At the end of that chapter, we talked about how there's two ways of reading some of these proverbs that Qoheleth puts forth. One could be this is just a very traditional wisdom statement that he is upholding and saying, here's a proverb and it's true. But then some commentators look at it and suggest he is presenting what we assume to be a common proverb of his day, and then the following verses then critique it and say, actually, I'm not so sure that's the case. So this is going to come into play again this week, particularly a few verses down. We'll get to it and you'll know when we get there, because it completely changes the meaning, whether you think that he is presenting this as his position or presenting you with something he doesn't actually agree with, despite the fact that it's a popular saying. So keep that in mind as we move forward here. Okay, I am going to break this chapter up into two sections here. The first one's going to be verses 1 through 9, and then verses 10 through 17 will be the second half, roughly. As I already mentioned, people break this down differently, but I think we can have two main thoughts for the chapter. So this is how we're going to study it. So let's just look at the first 9 verses right now. I'm just going to go ahead and try to read them together and see if we can follow the flow of thought, and I'll try to point out some stuff as we go along that we're going to talk about later so that you can see some of the linchpins of what makes these verses so difficult to understand and what we're actually talking about here. So I realize this is going to be a little bit of a tough one to follow along with, and honestly that's going to be in any English translation. This is just a hard chapter to translate well over into English, whether we're talking about Old King James style or something more modern. It can still be tough to understand, and depending on which version you use, what you have in front of you may end up looking very different from what you're about to hear me read. There's reasons for that. Don't worry, that's not anything to be concerned about. This is just, again, a difficult chapter to translate over into English. So if you see something different in front of you, keep an eye on that. We'll talk about it, and we'll try to figure out why it might look different in a different version. All right, verse 1. Who is as the wise person? Who knows the interpretation of a thing? A person's wisdom makes their face to shine, and the boldness of their face will be changed. I counsel you to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. That's interesting. That's something we're going to have to talk about here. Be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there's power, and who can say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps the commandment will feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Therefore the misery of man is great upon him, because he doesn't know that which is going to be, because who can tell him when it will be? There is no one who has power over the spirit to retain the spirit, nor power in the day of death. And there is no discharge in that war. We're going to talk about what that means. Neither shall wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I have seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There's a time wherein one man rules over another to his own hurt. One thing I want to point out is the amount of additional translation work scholars have to put into any Bible version for this. If you are using a Bible version that includes italics, something like the King James, or there are a couple other versions that do that, I want you to just look down through this chapter and take note of how many italicized words there are. And we've talked about this before on the podcast, but a quick refresher in case anyone's not familiar with it. There are some translations of the Bible that will italicize words that are not in the original languages. Whenever you are translating something from one language to another, you are going to come face to face with some words and concepts that just don't translate smoothly from the first language into the second. And so you have to add words or slightly change around, maybe make a noun an adjective or vice versa or something like that, just in order for it to make sense and not be absolutely clunky and read like a third grader's, homework that he wrote at 10 p.m. the night before. That's totally normal. It's okay. It's very common. It's a necessity in Bible translation or really any kind of translation. And so, in order to keep better transparency about how they are translating and what they are translating, certain Bible versions will italicize the words that they add in for clarity. And if you're someone who has been reading the Bible for a long time, you might not even notice those. Like, I know I have to really pay attention to try to catch them sometimes because I'm just so used to seeing that. I grew up using the King James, so I saw it so much, my brain doesn't even catch when they're italicized words half the time. But take a second and look at just how many there are in this chapter. A lot. And that's because there's a lot of unique Hebrew idioms in this chapter that just don't translate over great into English. So that's going to start to affect how we translate and interpret some of these passages. Now, I'm just going to tell you right off the bat how I initially read these verses. See if you relate to it. Let me know if you read them differently or if you saw a little bit of a different meaning in this than I did. But I see him asking about who is a wise person and who knows the interpretation of something. So he's talking about at least a self-proclaimed wise man. Because that's a question we have to ask, is like, everyone thinks they're smart, right? I like to think that if someone comes to me for advice, they're getting better wisdom than they would get going to someone else. And someone else thinks the same about me, probably, right? We all like to think, oh, we give wise counsel. We know what we're talking about. So who actually decides, is someone wise? So when he asks this question of who is a wise person, he could be actually talking about, like, oh, where's someone who really knows what he's talking about? Or could he be inviting people who think they are wise into dialogue with him here? Like, could he be saying, who among you thinks they are wise? Where is the self-proclaimed wise person here in this group? We've seen throughout this book that there are certain points where he seems to have some dialogue with the audience and where he almost expects feedback and maybe a little bit of pushback from them. So I could see this as his saying, like, who among you thinks they're wise? Who thinks they know what's going on in life? Who thinks they've got it all figured out? And he's going to try to break down those assumptions moving forward here. So he's saying that this at least self-proclaimed wise man is someone who claims to know the meaning of a matter. And that reminded me of how Qoheleth himself has tried to find the meaning of life, if you will, throughout this book, and yet decries the ability to find meaning in life at all, beyond just the little moments. So it seems like, as he's saying that wisdom makes someone's face to shine and the boldness of their face change, it seems like he's saying that somebody who thinks they have it figured out looks happy and confident, right? Like, they look maybe almost cocky about what they know about life. They're going through with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, and they think that they're better than everyone else. But then in verse 2, he says, I counsel you to keep the king's commandment. So I'm saying that the real wisdom is in following the king. Now, this is where I'm starting to get confused as I'm studying this and going, how do these two thoughts connect? Well, don't worry, we're going to get there. So he says, I pay attention to the mouth of the king in regard to the word of the oath of God. And then we have to start asking questions about what that means, but the idea seems to be that no matter how wise you think you are, you're still subject to the will of government over you, and that can't always be predicted. The whims of the rulers over you can't always be predicted. So the best way forward is just to go with the flow when you need to, but also take a stand when you need to. And this is along the lines of what a lot of commentaries would try to tell you about the chapter. Going back to Murphy's Word Biblical Commentary, he says that the wise advisor, for all of his gifts, is confronted by royal power and is totally dependent on the royal power. So, in other words, he is saying that Qoheleth is contrasting the position of a perceived wise man, a sage like himself, mind you, with a king, with a ruler, and saying that no matter how wise you are, the ruler has more power than you do. Wisdom does not bring with it power. So Murphy continues, the challenge to the wise, then, who would claim to know the divine action, is symbolic of the entire book. Although he was regarded as a sage, Qoheleth was intent on purifying wisdom of its short-sighted claims, and on making clear to the wise a truth in their own tradition: there is no wisdom, no understanding, and no counsel against the Lord. And there he quotes Proverbs 21:30. So basically, Qoheleth, in this view, is acknowledging the limitations of his own line of work. Brown, in the interpretation commentary, saw some similarity here to the words of Agur in Proverbs 30, verses 2 and 3. Surely I am more brutish than any man, and I have not the understanding of a man. I neither learned wisdom, nor have I the knowledge of the holy. Now, that always kind of amused me a little bit whenever I read Proverbs 30, because this Agur starts that way and then goes on to share his wisdom with you. So, he's just one of those people who's like, oh, I don't have a lot to say, I'm not very wise, and then goes on for an hour telling you about all the stuff he thinks you need to know about life. So, see, it seemed a little bit falsely humble to me, but either way. Brown continues, both Qoheleth and Agur show a profound sense of sapiential limitation. That's saying the limits of wisdom or the limits of knowledge. Whereas Agur, and I am not saying Al Gore, a lot of preachers in English will say Agur or Agor or something like that. Hebrew pronunciation would be closer to Agur. So, whereas Agur laments his lack of knowledge of divine matters, Qoheleth admits ignorance over the interpretation or solution of any matter. So Brown is contrasting the two characters here of Agur and Qoheleth. He's putting the two sages head to head. He says, all of life, from the particular to the globally abstract, is impenetrably deep for even the most discerning. Here, wisdom is the source of a cheerful disposition, but as Qoheleth has suggested elsewhere, the change in one's countenance may be only cosmetic, for wisdom is also accompanied by much vexation and sorrow. And he's referencing Ecclesiastes 1:18 there. Other commentators I found suggested a similarity to the wisdom of Ben Sirach, chapter 13, verse 25, that says the heart changes the countenance either for good or for evil. So you can see a little bit of a possible connection there with the thought from verse 1 that a man's wisdom makes his face to shine and the boldness of his face will be changed. It's possible. So the main thing I took out of this as I was reading through it is that the more you know, the more you realize how little you actually know. Let me say that one more time. The more you know, the more you realize how little you actually know. When I went to Bible college, it was really easy to get this feeling, I guess, where you just felt superior in your understanding because, I spend all day sitting in a classroom learning, and you're not consciously thinking about it. You're not like, oh, I'm way better than everyone else. It just starts to creep up on you. And, when you're in your first year of college, you realize that you don't fit in. You're the low man on the totem pole. But once you get to second year and there's people who are newer than you are, you start to feel a little bit more like big man on campus, and you know what you're doing and they don't. You can start to put other people down. That's why we call them sophomores. The word literally means wise fool. After you've had a year of studying some discipline and a little bit of experience, you start to think that you know more than you actually do. You are foolish in the way that you present your wisdom. And I remember one time a professor saying that you get your undergraduate degree, your bachelor's degree, and from that you learn all the answers. And then if you go for a master's degree, you learn all the questions. And I kind of laughed at that at the time. I'm like, I'm not entirely sure I understand. But then I went for a master's degree and I fully understood exactly what he meant. When you finish 4 years of studying one particular topic, especially something like theology, because I went to a Bible college, you start to think, oh yeah, I know all of this. Like I can rattle off the memory verses, the proof texts. I can tell you whatever you need to know on this given topic. I have an answer for everything. But then there's just something about going down the master's line of work, and at least with the people I studied with, they were much more interested in getting you to understand the broader topic than to just memorize information. And so we started to realize there's nuance here. It's not so black and white. And I remember one professor actually in my master's, one of my favorite professors in all the years that I was in college, and he was talking about a particular topic. I think it was just a systematic theology class. And he asked one of the students, "Oh, what do you believe about this topic?" And they gave him their answer, as we're wont to do. We want to look impressive in front of the professor, so we give a nice polished Bible college answer. And he goes, "Oh, okay, yep, I can see that. But if you take that view, here's all the problems with it. Now, here's the view that I take. And here's the problems with my view." And he just explained it that way. And it's like, and you could take either one, and that's okay. And in my head, I knew that was a thing, but I don't think I'd ever heard someone express it like that before. And so I'm just sitting there, mind blown in the middle of class, going, wait, is this the way we're supposed to be doing Bible study? Is it supposed to be like, oh, let's just talk about it? Let's be honest about the shortcomings of even our own views and acknowledge the potential validity of other views? That was just an experience that has stuck with me here. It kind of clicked what my professor back from undergrad was saying about now you're starting to understand that the questions are a lot bigger than the simple answers you thought you had. Right? It's kind of like when you learn math in school. Early on, you learn arithmetic, and it seems so nice and simple. What could be simpler than 2 plus 2 equals 4? That's math. And it's so easy, and it's so clean, and it's predictable, and it's nice. And then you start getting into algebra and geometry and trigonometry and calculus and all this, and you're like, oh, this is not so simple anymore. It's still math, at least in an overarching sense, but you start to realize how much more complex the answers are, and even the issues and the questions and the problems you're trying to solve. They're so much richer than just the simple answers that you thought answered everything back when you were in third grade arithmetic. The Bible is very much that way. But the problem is, so many Christians stop at third grade arithmetic level Bible because that's all that their churches teach them. And they say, well, this is the Bible. The Bible's simple, it's clean, it's easy to understand. And they never dig any deeper. And then they just think, oh, well, I understand all there is to know about the Bible. But there's so much more underneath if you'll just start to dig. And the more that you do start to, the more that you start to accumulate this knowledge, this wisdom, this understanding, the more you go, whoa, I actually know less than I think I do. I thought I knew 90% of everything there was to know about the Bible. But now that I've unlocked this, I still know the same amount. In fact, I know a little bit more now, but I realize that what I know is actually maybe 9% of what there is to know instead of 90. And that's the way this works. The more you know, the more you realize how little you actually know. And I want to acknowledge that can feel scary, particularly if you come from a tradition that emphasized certainty, knowing facts, knowing exactly what God wants, knowing exactly the specific meaning of a Bible passage or something along those lines. Because this feels like breaking down certainty. And if I am no longer sure about what a given text in the Bible says, or even what the Bible itself says, that feels like I'm questioning God, that feels like I'm questioning Christianity, and it starts to get dangerous for a lot of people. They feel like they are anathema in their circles. They're not welcome because they're asking questions and they already made them uncomfortable, and now they're making everyone else uncomfortable with their questions. And at least in the circles I grew up in, there was we wouldn't have said this, but there was an anti-intellectual bias. We wouldn't specifically keep you from going to college or anything like that. It definitely wasn't that bad. I mean, I know some communities are like that, where like, you don't need to go learn anything, just stay here. It wasn't that bad, but there was still this idea of like, don't let your education, especially if you go to a secular institution, don't let your education change what you believe about the Bible. What you have right now is everything there is to know about the Bible. Let it stay that way. And so the more educated someone becomes, if it's a good education anyway, they start to realize how much more complexity there is in these topics. And that starts to scare the people who haven't gone on the same journey you have. Let's say just even listening to this podcast, you learn a lot about the ancient Near Eastern culture, the stuff that you don't normally hear in church, right? And so you go to explain that to somebody else who maybe hasn't listened to the podcast and they're just used to hearing what they hear in church. This might scare them as like, why are you listening to that kind of thing? Why are you trying to tear down what I know about the Bible? And you're not. And you maybe even feel sad or guilty or confused over that because you feel like you appreciate the Bible more now, but other people around you don't seem to understand that. There is, in a lot of Christian circles, an unconscious or subconscious anti intellectual bias. We're afraid that faith and knowledge or intellect or academia are enemies. And we're afraid that one is going to take over the other. That if you pursue more knowledge, more learning, more education, you are putting your faith at risk. And anyone who has actually been on that journey, who has actually gotten further education, and particularly about the Bible and tried to study it more, will tell you they are not haters of the Bible. They're not coming in and now just flipped a switch and said, okay, because I went and got a master's degree or a doctorate, now I automatically hate the Bible and I have to fight against it. Now, they're going to tell you that they love the Bible. They love Jesus. They love God. They love Christianity. And yet, the more they've studied, the more they've understood these complexities. And because the church just presents all of this as simple truths, they now feel lied to about it when they realize that the Bible's not actually as simple as they were led to believe. Sure, parts of it are. Sure, maybe the gospel message is relatively simple, but that doesn't mean the whole of the Bible is simple. And so I'm just warning you here that the more you present yourself as not knowing things for certain, the more you present yourself as open to other views, the more you're going to make people who require certainty uncomfortable. Because to them, uncertainty means a lack of faith, a lack of trust. It means you're tearing down the Bible. And that's not what it means. Uncertainty in what I believe about something is not the same thing as uncertainty about that thing itself. It is just simply honest and a good practice to admit I don't know for sure if my interpretation of the Bible is 100% right. But that doesn't mean that the Bible isn't right. We have to separate our interpretation of the text from the text itself. The text can mean what it means, but that doesn't mean that we fully understand it or have fully gotten it right. We seem to think that questioning a given understanding or interpretation of the text means we're questioning the Bible itself. Well, you're not in the place of God. And if I question what you've heard about the Bible, what you believe about the Bible, that's not the same thing as questioning the Bible itself. So we have to separate those things and realize that it is okay to question, because in reality, no matter how much you say the Bible says, the Bible says, the Bible says, what you really mean is I say the Bible says. Because I can get two different people from two opposite sides of the belief spectrum here, someone on the far right wing of beliefs and someone on the far left wing of beliefs, and have them both be Christian, and they can both believe totally opposing things and say that the Bible backs up their positions. There are Republicans who are Christian. There are Democrats who are Christian. There are people who are for one issue that are Christian, people who are against the same issue who are Christian. So we can't ever just say, oh, well, the Bible says this and it's super clear, and if you go against that, you're going against God. No, I'm just going against your idea of what you think the Bible says. We have to be honest enough to admit that none of us is God, and we can disagree on what the text in front of us says. And we don't have to be afraid of that. We don't even have to feel like that's actually tearing down certainty. You can still feel certain that there's a God out there. You can still feel certain that the Bible is true. But it's not helpful when you apply that same level of definitive certainty to your interpretation of those things. So let's have some humility and some honesty as we study these texts. I know that was a little bit of a rabbit trail there, but that was just some of the thoughts that I had originally going through this chapter and what Qoheleth is saying about the person who thinks themselves to be wise. Now, let's talk about what this chapter is actually saying, because I think the more we look into this, the more we drill down, we can see much more complex layers in these several verses here. So, as I was studying this chapter and trying to figure out what it means, the first thing that really stood out to me as leading me down the path of figuring out an answer to this chapter was the mention of somebody's face shining. This is right here in verse 1. A person's wisdom makes their face to shine. And you'll get different translations say slightly different things. They'll say brightens his countenance, makes him cheerful, something along those lines. Most scholars seem to think that the idea is of brightening the appearance or the countenance, and there's a lot of Hebraisms in this chapter dealing with a person's face. To stand in front of someone in Hebrew is to stand before their face. To leave someone might be to depart from their face. In fact, even verse 3, where it says, "Be not hasty to go out of his sight," we'll talk about what that means in a minute here. But what is translated as sight is actually face. Be not hasty to go out from before his face. So there, verse 12, I see here too. Those who fear God, which fear before him. That's actually which fear before his face. So there's this frequent repetition of the idea of being in front of somebody's face here. And talking about face shining, I started thinking, what people in the Bible have had their face shine? Anyone got any ideas? I'd play some Jeopardy music here, but we don't want to get a copyright infringement notification for that. So instead, you just gotta give me a guess here. Who in the Bible had their face shine? And if you went to Sunday school or worked in a Sunday school, you know that the answer to every single Bible question that you don't know the answer to is either Moses or Jesus. Doesn't matter what the question is. Sunday school teacher asks a question, the answer is invariably either going to be Moses or Jesus. You're safe given those answers, right? Well, believe it or not, in this case, both are actually the right answer. Moses and Jesus. If we remember when Moses was on Mount Sinai getting the instructions, the Torah from God, as he comes back down, at one point his face shone because of the glory of the presence of God that he had seen. And that's a whole other text for another day, because there's a whole thing about how he had to cover his face with the way it was shining. And that means the exact opposite of what most people think it means when they read that passage. But as we say here far too often on the podcast, that's another issue for another day. If we jump ahead, though, into the New Testament, Jesus on the mountain, when what we often call the Mount of Transfiguration, when he meets with God before his crucifixion, and he sees both Moses and Elijah, Matthew draws on the story of Moses at Sinai and says that Jesus' face shone. So there's this idea of a couple of characters in the Bible where they are in the presence of God and their face shines. So that got me thinking here, is there a connection with what Qoheleth is saying of somebody's face shining with what happened to Moses or Jesus? See, these are the sorts of hyperlinks that we should be looking for and going, now I need to reread what he's talking about here with wisdom in comparison to what I know about Moses, in comparison to what I know about Jesus. Are any parts of their story sticking out to me as similar to something in this given passage? Interestingly enough, as I was doing this study, I came across a quote from a French Assyriologist named Elena Cassin. And this is a complete sidetrack. It has absolutely nothing to do with anything here. But as I was looking this up, she actually lived to be 102. I saw she was born in 1909 and died in 2011. And I just saw those dates together. I'm like, how is that even possible? Born in 1909, died in 2011. That is insanity. But as I was doing some study, I came across this quote. And remember, I said she was a French Assyriologist. That means she was in France, and that means that in order to get this quote, I had to translate French. So this is the stuff I go through for you people, okay? This is how much I sacrifice for the podcast. You know, most people, they spend their evenings hanging out with friends, they go to a sports game, they go to the bar, right? I am at my home translating French from a commentary for my Bible podcast. Okay, don't feel too badly for me though, because all I had to do was copy and paste into Google Translate, but still. Once I actually stopped and thought about what I was doing, I had to laugh. I think it was kind of funny. But yeah, Elena Cassin, French Assyriologist, so her specialty is in stuff dealing with Assyria. She observed in the thinking of the Mesopotamians, any intense form of vitality, and taking this word in a very broad sense, can mean beauty, youth, joy, power, vigor, as well as the person with great sexual vigor, everything that is overflowing with life, life that which is perfectly pure and complete, manifests itself by a dazzling emanation from light. And conversely, as much as beauty and wisdom are luminous, so much wickedness and madness are opaque. End of quote. So, in other words, what she's saying is that in ancient Near Eastern culture, a bright, cheery face was the sign of someone who had the blessing of the gods because they had learned how to enjoy life. Somebody who just has that lust for life, right? They're just energetic about everything and their face beams. That is somebody who has learned the secret to making the most out of life and is therefore blessed by God. That is an ancient concept of having a cheery countenance. That got me thinking a little bit here. Okay, so this isn't just a phrase from the Hebrew Bible, this is something going on in culture there, but I still hadn't quite connected the dots of what all that meant. So then I started looking at where Qoheleth says in verse 1, who knows the interpretation of a thing? And that word interpretation, it's the Hebrew word pesher. It shows up just this one time in Hebrew. The fancy word for that is a hapax legomenon. Literally means a one-time word, basically, a once-said word. It's something that only shows up once in a given text. So in the entirety of the Tanakh, from Genesis to Malachi, there is only one time that this Hebrew word, pesher, shows up. That's what most commentaries will tell you. But that's not entirely the case. See, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, is not completely written in Hebrew. There are a few portions that are also written in Aramaic, mostly in Daniel and Ezra, and there's a couple others sprinkled throughout as well. It's not a lot, but it is just enough to give us some context for this word. Because, see, Aramaic and Hebrew are very, very similar languages, much like Spanish and Portuguese. They're not identical, but if you can understand one, you're going to get the idea of what is being said in the other. So, wouldn't you know, this pesher word shows up in Aramaic, almost identical word, basically just slightly different vowels, 31 times in the book of Daniel alone. That's interesting. And then a very similar and basically related root of pother. So you have pesher, pother. You can kind of hear a little bit of similarity there. Shows up a few times in Genesis 40 and 41. You say, all right, what's the big deal? Well, in Daniel, almost all of the times that the word pesher, but the Aramaic version shows up, it's talking about the interpretation of dreams. Now, I want you to think about the book of Daniel. Where did most of that book take place? If you say in Babylon, you're right, but more specifically, in the court of the kings. Remember what we said about this chapter. It's talking about conduct in a royal court. All right, interesting. Going to Genesis 40 and 41, it's used of Joseph's interpreting skills, and Joseph was in the royal court of Pharaoh. So we're starting to see some connections here where this idea of interpretation is dealing with interpretation of dreams in a royal court setting. Fascinating. And then, furthermore, that same root word shows up quite a bit in non-biblical literature from Qumran. You remember the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the caves at Qumran? Well, there were a whole bunch of works that were found there, not just biblical books, but a lot of writings from around the same time that either didn't end up in the Bible or just weren't spiritual in nature. Well, this same root word shows up a lot there, further suggesting that this idea of interpretation doesn't deal with just knowing something, right? It's not just when it says who knows the interpretation of a thing, he's not just saying who knows the meaning of life or the answer to this riddle, right? It goes beyond that. And it actually refers to something that's called mantic wisdom. And mantic wisdom is the ability to prophetically unravel divinely communicated mysteries. So going back into Ecclesiastes 1 now, we're starting to get a fuller picture of what he's talking about. He's not just asking who's wise and who knows how to interpret stuff. He doesn't mean languages, and he doesn't mean who can get to the solution of my riddle about life. He's actually comparing his audience to both Joseph and Daniel, and I think you could probably even lump in Moses there too, because we're talking about the face shining. But dealing with interpreting a matter, it's actually a reference to someone who is able to interpret prophetic dreams. So he's saying to his audience, who here is like Daniel? Who here is like Joseph? And both of them worked for an evil empire. Egypt is usually not a great entity in the Bible, and Babylon certainly isn't. That's the archetypal villain in the Bible. So both Joseph and Daniel worked for an evil empire, but made a significant impact by knowing when to blend in and when to stand out. Remember, Joseph went along with the flow. He helped build Egypt. In fact, this is a whole other study for another day, but it's quite likely that the work that Joseph did in building the storehouses and everything to prepare through that time of famine, it's quite likely that the governmental policies he implemented allowed the next regime to come in and oppress his own people and turn them into slaves, which is where you get Exodus and Moses enters the picture. So he's working for a corrupt government. And yet there's also times when he knew to stand up for what he believed in, like when Potiphar's wife was trying to seduce him, or when his brothers came into town. And then same thing with Daniel. He went along with the empire. He was an advisor in that court. We don't know exactly what he advised on, whether it was war or policies or whatever, but whenever there's empire, whenever there's government, someone is getting oppressed, someone's getting trodden underfoot, someone's getting the short end of the stick, and so he probably would have been partially responsible for that too. But then there were also times when he said, I'm not going any further than this. And you have the incident with his faith and getting cast into the lion's den. So we're starting to get a little bit at the meaning of these verses here. And interestingly enough, all of this also fits in with Qoheleth's observation later in the chapter that no one really knows the future. If he's asking who here is wise like Joseph and Daniel enough to interpret a prophetic dream about the future, it only makes sense that later on he would talk more about the future. And so when he brings up that no one knows the future, it's like he's actually questioning the value of being someone who can interpret prophetic dreams. This is where I think we're getting to the linchpin of understanding what this passage means. I think Qoheleth was quoting popular wisdom here about beaming people, someone with a bright shining face, being gifted, and he's challenging the wisdom of that. So here's the idea. Let's say that it was just common knowledge back then that if somebody had a really radiant face, that meant that they were gifted by the gods. And so maybe they would be able to interpret some visions or dreams or know something about the future. So you might go to them when you want to ask if your next business venture is going to turn out okay, right? You might start using them like a magic 8-ball. And that just seemed to be the concept that people had back then. And so Qoheleth is taking that idea and saying, you think it would be good to be that kind of person, because then you get to share your wisdom with everyone else. But it's not actually as good as you think it is. See, he's critiqued a lot of things up until this point, right? He's critiqued finding satisfaction and success in money alone. He's critiqued trying to find success in being a workaholic. He's critiqued trying to find success in rising up the political ladder. And now it seems like he's taking this idea that, well, maybe success in life is just a gift that some people have from the gods and other people don't. And he's going, actually, no. That's not the case either. Even if you could be a prophetic sage like Joseph or Daniel, you are no better off. Even if you think you're wiser than a ruler, you can't actually predict what they're going to do. Even if you seem to have some mystical connection to another realm, you're no better off than anyone else because that doesn't guarantee you success. So you can't say success is just a gift that some people have and some people don't. Joy in life is a gift that you choose to give yourself. You can't blame it on anyone else that you didn't get what somebody else got. I can just imagine young people in Qoheleth's day going, man, I wish I was like that person. Man, they really have it. They just have that charisma. They have that X factor. They have it. They are it, right? And he's saying, no, actually, that's not the case. No one is born with a golden ticket that guarantees success. No matter how much charm they have, no matter how popular they seem to be, no matter how successful they may seem to be, they are just as susceptible to falling out of favor or having a business deal go wrong or losing all of their possessions in a fire or having them stolen or having their whole family die in a freak accident like Job had or all these things. Like, no one is safe. You can't just say, oh, they have it good, so they must be blessed of God. No, they might have it good today, but you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. There's a journal article I came across by Scott Jones called Qoheleth's Courtly Wisdom, Ecclesiastes 8, 1-9. And that's a typical academic sounding title for you, but I am going to toss that in the recommended resources. It is academic journal, so it's not exactly the easiest read, but it's very insightful into understanding this first half of the chapter. And in it, he says, such claims to knowledge of the future and divine judgment are to be looked upon with suspicion, or at least with caution. For Qoheleth, there is a more immediate concern, minimizing risk right now. The more I thought about it, the more I started realizing that all this rhetoric against knowing the future and being able to predict what's going to happen, this could also counter Qoheleth's dismissal in the previous chapter of those who only look to the past. Remember, we talked about this last week where he said, why are you going around saying things used to be better in the good old days? That's not a wise path of thought to follow. And here he's saying, well, if you're obsessed with the future, that's not wise either. If you think all of your hope lies in the future, that's no better than the person who only focuses on the past. That really stuck out to me as something I just hadn't quite considered before, because so many Christians put the entirety of their hope in the future. They have this idea of life sucks right now, but it's going to be perfect in heaven, right? And they just say everything's against me right now, but I'm going to be okay once I cross those pearly gates. And I think Qoheleth would kind of question that and say, if you only see hope in the future, then you're going to live miserably in the only life that you know you have. If you're putting all your eggs in the basket of the next life, well, that's a basket that you don't know for sure is actually there. It very well may be, and I believe that it is. But remember, throughout Ecclesiastes, we're just focusing on what we actually know. And no matter how much you believe in an afterlife, we don't know for sure that there is one. We don't know what's coming after us, if anything. So Qoheleth is saying that it's not wise to put all of your hope in the future and miss out on everything here in this life. If all you do is think things are going to get better in the future, well, then you're no better than the person who thinks things are so much worse than they used to be in the past. And remember, his solution to that from last week was that we have to live in the present by what he called fearing God. That's the middle ground that says, I'm just going to accept value where I am without constantly pushing for it in the future and without pining for it in the past. I am just going to try to make the most of the moment that I am in now. Moving into verse 2, we see, again, those italics that I talked about there. You might have something along the lines of, I counsel you to keep the king's commandment, I charge you, I say to you, keep the king's commandment, whatever it may be. This is difficult because in Hebrew you have I, and then you have keep the king's commandment. But keep is a second person command. It's an imperative. So it's not saying I personally keep the king's commandment. It's just the pronoun I, and then the imperative, the command, you keep the king's commandment. So a lot of translators think that there's an assumed verb in there of something along the lines of say. I say to you, keep the king's commandment, or I advise you to keep the king's commandment. So that's why you're going to get some different translation options there. And Qoheleth says to do this in regard to the oath of God. Literally in Hebrew it reads, in regards to the word of the oath of God. So what the heck is that? Well, first we gotta decide how exactly is of being used there. Because if I said, I don't know, this is the report of Colin, does that mean this is Colin's report? Is this somebody else's report about Colin? Is this a report of something that Colin owns? You see how all of that can be the report of Colin, but what exactly does it mean is going to change based on context. And we don't exactly have context here, so we have multiple options. The oath of God could be God's oath to the patriarchs back in Genesis of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Qoheleth is speaking to a Jewish audience, so he could be saying, do this in remembrance of God's oath to the patriarchs. As part of the Jewish covenant, obey the king. It could be talking about God's oath to the king, assuming that God made an oath that if the king will follow him, God will bless him, or something along those lines. Is it actually flipped? Is it the king's oath to God? Maybe the king said, if you give me power, I will worship you. Is it your oath of loyalty to the king before God? Like the oath of God is in the presence of the king. Is it your personal oath to God about something? Is it your oath before the king as if he is in the place of God? That's something that was common in the ancient world. So you see how all of these are possibilities here. And honestly, I'm not even sure which way we would go with this. I think it might be purposefully ambiguous in order to get us to think, because each of these ends up with a different meaning. If he's saying keep the king's commandment as you would an oath toward God, well, that's pretty serious in saying that we should just obey whatever the king says. If he's saying keep the king's commandment as if the king is in the place of God, or because God backs the king, or because God put him there in power, then again, we are saying the king is in a place of authority because God put him there, and so I have to do whatever he says in order to please God. But what if you take it in the reverse and think that this is about your kind of oath toward God, or God's oath covenant to the patriarchs? Then it could be saying, keep the king's commandment, but only so far as it is in line with the oath of God. So sometimes the better thing to do is to follow God rather than government. See, either one of those is possible, but it leads you down very different paths. And this is an important concept to wrap our minds around because, at least here in America, we're kind of at this dividing point where some people will say you should follow God over government, and others will say you should follow government because God put them there. And honestly, most people just switch around which one they say based on whoever is in power and whether or not they like that person. Like growing up in a very conservative circle, whenever there was a Republican in power in the White House, we'd say, well, we have to submit to authority because God's the one who put him there, and I just don't understand why people won't follow the rules. It'd be so much easier if everybody just followed the rules. But then as soon as a Democrat got in power, we said, oh man, we have to obey God rather than man. We have to be ready for persecution, stand for our faith no matter what the government tells us to do. And see, it flip-flops based on whether or not you agree with the person in power. And it can't be that way. You can't just pick and choose which position you're going to take based on whether or not you agree with the person who's currently in a position of power. So which is it? Is it God over government at all times, or is it God put governmental authority there at all times? Well, the funny thing is, the people who tend to assume that God puts authorities in place, they would say he sets up kings and he tears them down, something like that. They're going to more often, I'll just say, be on the conservative side of an issue. But if you really believe that, if you believe that whoever is in power is there because God wanted them there, then you have to oppose any form of revolution against government. Now, we try usually not to get too political here on the podcast, but we also want to be honest to the text, and this is a very political chapter. I mean, he's speaking to people in a royal court, so we kind of have to lean into it a little bit. If we look at January 6th, 2021, the vast majority of Christians that I know oppose that and say it was wrong for people to behave that way, and many of them claim to be Christian. That's not the way that we think a Christian should behave. That went against the peaceful transition of power that we have had throughout our nation's history. And that's all well and good, but those were often the exact same people who applauded the founding fathers as these paragons of Christian virtue, and they rebelled against England. So I realize the situations aren't exactly the same, but they are kind of similar between January 6th and the Revolutionary War. We don't like the government that is currently over us. We don't like what they're doing, so we're going to revolt and put in our own. That's kind of similar. Again, not a one-for-one correspondence, but it's so funny how many people are not okay with one because it makes them uncomfortable, but they're cool accepting the other. Now, I am not saying that we should be okay with the January 6th events. And I'm not even necessarily saying that we have to be against the Revolutionary War. I'm very thankful to be an American. I appreciate this country, and I drink a whole lot of hot tea, so I would not want to be paying a lot of tax to Britain for that. But that being said, there were a lot of Christians, and in particular ministers, during the Revolutionary War who decided to conscientiously object to that war, and they were not treated well by Christians who wanted to fight the war. And it's just so amazing to me how many Christians want to emphasize God's sovereignty and the way that he puts people in power, and they're just there because they're supposed to be, so we just have to follow them. But yet those same people celebrate the 4th of July with fireworks and barbecues every year. See, we're inconsistent in this based on whether we think it matches our belief system or not. And I'm not comfortable saying someone is in power because God put them there. Now, I do believe that God can affect the events of human history, but if you think that someone with authority has it because God put them there, then you have to deal with the number of times that people have abused their power and done horrible things and say that's what God wanted because he knew it was going to happen and he put them there. And so any rebellion against that is wrong. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in World War II Germany was wrong. Anne Frank was wrong. Harriet Tubman was wrong. How far do we want to go with this? It's not great once you start playing it out because most people with power end up abusing that power in some way or another. What's the old saying? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. There's no exceptions to it. Once someone gets some power, it's going to go wrong. That is just the story of humanity. And if you think it's always wrong to oppose people in power because, God's sovereign and he's the one who put them there, how do you explain that God was okay leading the enslaved Israelites out of powerful Egypt? How are you okay with Israel fighting back against the nations that took them captive in the time of the judges and things like that? Right? None of us actually believe that. We're not consistent enough in that because it just doesn't work once you start thinking it out. And some of you listening might be like, okay, but what does that actually have to do with anything with me today? You're talking about random political events. Well, it doesn't just stay in the realm of politics. See, this happens a lot in churches where we think just because someone is standing behind a pulpit, just because a church voted them in, just because another church higher up the food chain appointed them to us, that they must be what God has for us. And so if God put them there, who am I to question? See, this is the problem of, in a political sense, it would be called the divine right of kings. The king is there because God wants him to be there. And we do this in churches too. And we say, well, this is the pastor we got, and so God must have wanted us to have him. But then he says something that you're like, oh, that makes me a little uncomfortable. But now you can't disagree because God's the one who put them there, and God must know what you need more than you do, so the pastor must know what you need more than you do. And it creates this culture where people just start assuming that means I can't question what the guy behind the pulpit says because that's tantamount to questioning God. And that is a dangerous place to be in. People are not God. And as soon as you give someone the power of being able to speak for God, you run into a lot of issues. This is what happens in verse 3, where Qoheleth says, don't be hasty to go out of his sight. We'll talk about that in a second. Stand not in an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of the king is, there is power, and who can say to him, what are you doing? See, if we take this whole debate that we had in verse 2 about what exactly is the oath of God and which way does it lean about what it means, well, if you take that and suggest that having a king over you is divinely appointed, having a ruler over you is divinely appointed, having a pastor over you is divinely appointed, then we get to verse 4. Who can say to him, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? What you just said is a little off. You can't say that because then you're questioning God. So in this simple statement in verse 4, that just seems to be traditional wisdom, like, who's going to tell the king what to do? Qoheleth is actually couching a very radical critique of power. Once you allow someone to speak on behalf of God, you can no longer question their words and actions. That's why all throughout this podcast we try to say, I am not telling you the Christian thing to believe. I am not telling you this is the answer, because I don't want to claim to speak to God in this. I want to be able to try to show you some stuff that you're not going to learn from other sources, but I don't claim to have what God wants for you. Yeah, he can take what I say and do whatever he wants with it, and so can you, but I'm not going to try to say, just because I studied the Bible, therefore this is what God wanted you to hear. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't want the kind of power of being in the place of God for anyone. And too many pastors, preachers, evangelists, missionaries accept that sort of thing when that is not healthy. Brown picks up again in the interpretation commentary. Qoheleth exhorts the reader to obey the king without question or hesitation because of a sacred oath or covenant. The king can be challenged no more than God's will can be contested. For Paul, similar to the ancient sage, obedience to the ruling authority rests on a sacral relationship. The reigning authority is the servant of God. For Qoheleth, however, such sacred civility is more pragmatically oriented. Wisdom for the sage serves to foster an attitude of compliance before the one who holds the reins of power. Compared to the king's might, the subject's power is of mere relative extent, all the more so before the Almighty. Before omniscience, one can only claim that deference is warranted. In addition, the discerning person knows that every incident under heaven has its, quote, time and way, literally time and judgment. Such an awareness fosters an attitude of acceptance as well as a level of awareness that is, however, easily obfuscated by the trouble of mortals, the evil machinations to which human beings are so inclined. See chapter 7, verse 29. Qoheleth provides both a realistic assessment of royal power and a survivalist guide for conducting oneself before such power. However, underlying his advice, in contrast to Paul's civil theology in Romans 13, is a cynical awareness of the human tendency to abuse power, particularly in the form of economic control. Qoheleth acknowledges that kings, and indeed anyone who holds authority over another, tend to wield their power at the expense of others. The exercise of authority, royal or otherwise, consistently bears a destructive potential that the sage observes. End of quote. So, throughout the Bible, we get different perspectives on how to respond to power. And honestly, they kind of differ from what you're going to hear a lot of Christians think, because most of the time the idea is go along with it. Don't try to completely change the system that you're in. And honestly, I think there's just some practicality to that. Like, you have to have some delusions of grandeur to think that you, as one person, can completely change a corrupt system. And in all honesty, every empire brings with it both good and bad. Whether we're talking about Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Persia, Rome, you can even look at something like Nazi Germany and say they did certain things to improve the infrastructure of Germany. Now, they also did a lot of really evil things. Every empire is going to bring some improvement, but also trample down a lot of people under their feet. So the biblical pattern seems to be, as much as possible, just go along with the systems of your day, because whether you like them or not, they're going to be there. And yes, they're going to cause some harm, but they're also going to bring about some benefits that you wouldn't be able to enjoy outside of them. Yeah, it's kind of like having technology. Technology always brings with it both positives and negatives, both improvements and drawbacks. And there are some people who look only at the negative and say, look at how much privacy we're giving up. Look at how much we've lost connection with each other. Look at how much we don't know what's true and what to believe anymore. But if you give up, say, a cell phone or some other form of technology because of all of those valid concerns, you're not going to be able to appreciate any of the benefits of it. And seeing as most of the world has technology like that and relies on it now, you are effectively removing yourself from any cultural relevance if you choose to take that out of your own life. So the pattern of the Bible is go along with it. Use the cell phone, but use it wisely and know when to turn it off. And it's kind of the same thing with empire. Appreciate the benefits of it. Take advantage of the benefits of it, but also stand up when you need to. Be like Joseph, be like Daniel, and say, eventually, enough is enough, and what power I have, I can use to change the system from within. Now, that being said, I think it's important that we recognize that the Bible also has room for dissent outside of empire. Sometimes the best thing that you can do is be like Jesus and basically start your own movement. Get us completely outside the realm of empire and say, we are going to go outside the fort and we're going to storm it with our own army. And we have to remember, too, that the majority of the Bible, particularly the Tanakh, the Old Testament, was written by impoverished, oppressed, abused, underprivileged people. It was not the work of the wealthy. Throughout the history of the Old Testament, we have the Israelites enslaved. We have them taken captive by other nations several times. We have them oppressed by foreign powers several times. These are the underdogs. These are stories from the people on the business end of power, the ones that have to deal with the downsides of empire, the ones who have been trodden down by empire. And so, whenever you have a work that is from a minority point of view, you're going to have a different perspective than something that was written by people holding power. So much of the Bible assumes that its audience is an oppressed minority. And here in America, we are not that, especially if you're like me and you're a white Protestant Christian male. That's the height of privilege in America. So, do we have to look at these texts differently based on the amount of power that we have? Because if you are sitting around as an oppressed minority in an abusive government, there's not a lot you can do. You don't have a say in what's going on, especially in the ancient world. We can't just import our modern day idea of government on the ancient world. The average ancient person never met their ruler. They probably didn't even know their name half the time. And there was no hope of being able to write to their local congressman and try to change a bill, right? You just had to go along with it. And there was comfort in thinking that, well, maybe God put that person there in that authority, and God's the one who's going to bring them to justice eventually. God's the one who is going to flip the tables eventually. But what if you're the person with power? What if you're coming from not a minority position, but a majority position, like I'm assuming many of us listening today are? Does that change the way we read and interpret these verses? It very well may. Let's look at verse 3. It says, "Be not hasty to go out of his sight." Just reading that in English, you're going to get a very different idea than what it actually means in Hebrew. As I read it in English, it reminded me of Cain in Genesis 4 leaving God's presence. So the meaning then would seem to be, don't take yourself out of favor with a powerful person. Don't rush to get out of their presence, out from before their face, out from being a part of their court, unless absolutely necessary. Don't make enemies in high places. But that's not actually what the Hebrew means. It literally translates to don't be terrified in his presence. Okay, but we still have an issue, because whose sight are we talking about here? The previous verse had both God and the king mentioned. So is this saying don't be terrified of God, or don't be terrified in the presence of a king? And if it's that second option, is it kind of riffing off of like Nehemiah 2 and saying that you should appear stoic in the presence of a ruler? In Nehemiah's account, he said that no one was allowed to appear sad before the king in his day. So is it something like that? Don't show your emotions in front of a superior? Or is it saying that you shouldn't let their power intimidate you? Don't be terrified in their presence. And see, it can go in any one of these directions again. And then when verse 3 says, "Stand not in an evil thing," the Net Bible Notes interprets this as do not stand up for a bad cause. And that brings up the issue of, well, what exactly is a bad cause? Well, if we're talking about the king here, that could very well be something along the lines of sedition, a plot against the king. And he's saying, probably not going to want to get yourself involved in that sort of thing, because those tend to backfire. And if they do, it ain't going to go well for you. But you could also read this evil thing, this bad matter, this bad cause, to be something that the king wants you to do as a member of his court. And Qoheleth could then be saying, even while pressing for deference to the ruler, he could be saying, don't get involved in something that goes against your morals. And that could be possible too, because it often is those over us in the system who push us to cut corners. We already covered verse 4. Verse 5 literally reads, the one who observes commandments will not know an evil matter. You might see some difference there from your Bible translation. The King James says, whoso keeps the commandment shall feel no evil thing. Well, feel there is actually know. And so it's saying whoever keeps the commandment will know no evil thing. Now, I just want you to think for a second about having the word know that close to the word evil, ra. Does that remind you of anything, particularly if you've listened to our Genesis 1 through 3 series? How about the tree of knowing good and evil, of discerning good and not good? Surely a verse with the words know and evil side by side is drawing on Eden imagery here. And remember, in that section of the Bible, to know or to discern good and evil didn't mean that you didn't actually know what good and evil were. It means that you are deciding for yourself what is good and what is wrong. So is this verse drawing on that when it says that the person who keeps the commandment does not know an evil thing? Does that mean that they are not discerning some new evil for themselves because they are following the commandment? And even this verse you can take in either a positive or a negative sense. Is it a good thing that because you're just going along following the rules, you don't have to make decisions for yourself about what's right or wrong? Or is that a bad thing because you're not exercising your own discernment? And he doesn't necessarily say. In fact, it almost seems like he's contrasting here in verse 5 the person who keeps the commandment with the wise man who discerns time and judgment on his own. Now, most translations take this word judgment, mishpat in Hebrew, as if it means discernment. And it can, but throughout Ecclesiastes, it mostly means a time of judgment, when you're actually like standing before God as judge and determining if you did what was right or wrong. Interestingly enough, once translated into Latin in the Vulgate, Jerome translated this as a convenient time. So he kind of put the two ideas together and said that judgment is actually talking about something that is fitting, so a convenient time. But what's weird about it is a few years earlier, he had written an Ecclesiastes commentary, and he had translated it differently there. There he said a time of judgment. So just kind of funny, he had two different ideas there. The word can also mean law or legal ruling, so I kind of lean into a little bit of that idea here, where it seems to be saying that the wise heart knows both time and law, knows both culture, the time he's in, and law, what is expected of him. Some commentators explain this as saying that the wise person's heart knows the time of judgment, like a time of judgment is coming. But Qoheleth laments a little further down that we don't actually know when, if at all, justice is going to happen. So in this case, I kind of prefer the literalistic King James rendering that suggests a wise person discerns the culture and is aware of the rules over him. You know, if we're kind of going with this idea of subtle civil resistance against ruling powers, you don't know what you can get away with if you don't know how the system works. Right? When we were in college, we had a pretty extensive handbook of rules and regulations of what we could and couldn't do. And the people who always got in trouble were the ones who were supposed to have read the handbook, but didn't, so they didn't realize that what they were doing crossed over the line, and they got caught doing it. But the people who were smart read the handbook inside and out, basically memorized it, so they knew all the loopholes that they could get away with. And I think Qoheleth, as a pragmatist, might be kind of saying, like, you gotta know the way the system works to know how best to game it. And he seems to be presenting a contrast then between the person who follows all the rules and is blissfully ignorant, the person who says keeps the commandment and knows no evil thing. That's not a good thing, I don't think, to not know an evil thing. He's saying you aren't actually making choices for yourself about whether or not you agree with something. You're just going along with it because you were told. So he contrasts that person with the wise person who knows when to play his cards to win against the house. Either way, the middle of this verse is a pivot point for the chapter, because you kind of read it at first and you're thinking he's saying that good soldiers follow orders.
Good soldiers follow orders.
But then he reminds you that everyone will actually have their day in court, if you will. And so if even the highest government officials will eventually have to answer for their deeds, and quite likely in a bloody fashion, most politics throughout history have not been peaceful transitions of power. They have ended in coups. So if that's the case, especially in the ancient world, you might want to rethink how much stock you place in political power. Remember, Qoheleth's been talking about the meaning of life and the things that you find satisfaction and success in, and how you measure success in your life and what the good life is. And he's attacked riches. He's attacked trying to climb up the corporate ladder. And here he's saying, don't cut corners and buddy with political power. It's kind of like warning against the mafia life, right? Whenever you watch a good mafia movie or TV show, you always get that one person who doesn't want to get caught up in it, but there's just one teensy little decision that they compromise on, and then they have to make a bunch more compromises, and they go from being this good person who made a bad choice to being this person who has now done a lot of bad things and is morally compromised. And so I think he's kind of warning about that, like, don't cut those corners. When the person comes to you with an offer you can't refuse it if it goes against your morals or makes you feel uncomfortable. Verse 6 is another one where we have multiple divergent options on how you can understand this. Because to every purpose there is time and judgment, therefore the misery of man is great upon him. Now, this literally reads, the evil of the man weighs heavily on him. So in Hebrew, there's a definite article before man. It is not just man in general, but actually the man. The misery of the man, and misery is the word evil. So the evil of the man weighs heavily on him. So who is the man?
But in the end, you're just going to lose big time because the world is run by the man.
Who?
The man. Oh, you don't know the man?
Well, who is the man that we've been talking about so far in this chapter? A king. So some scholars think that in this verse, the man is the king. But then we have to ask, upon whom is the evil of the man great? Because it says, upon him. Well, who's him? Is it the king, or is it the people under him? Because remember, misery is evil, so the evil of the man is great upon him. Let's say king. The evil of the king is great upon him. Does that mean that evil weighs heavily upon the conscience of the king? And when it says the evil of the king, is that the king's personal things that he's done wrong, or is that the evil that he has to deal with in his kingdom? So are we dealing with a bad man, or a man who has a lot of bad people under him that he has to deal with? And then the weight of it, is that upon the man of the king, saying it weighs heavily on his conscience, or is it saying that it is oppressive of the people under him when there is an evil king? You see how this can go in so many different directions, it feels like we're talking in circles? Well, whichever view you take on that, I think the important thing to realize is that if this is referring to the king, which I think it is, it's significant that he's not called a king here. He's called the man, because that emphasizes his humanity in opposition to his perceived godhood that we've talked about before, this whole divine right of kings idea that, God set up the king and so he's in the place of God to the people. Well, in this verse, he's presented as just a man. No matter how much power over people a person has, no one has power over God. No one has power over death. We're going to get to that in just a second here. So in that case, this verse means that a wise person knows when to act and when not to act, since there is a time for everything, and evil in the land will weigh heavily on the ruler. Now, it's also possible that verse 5, whoever keeps the commandment will know no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. It's possible that was conventional wisdom that Qoheleth is now critiquing in verses 6 and 7 by saying that even a wise man may be miserable, which is a possible translation of that word for evil, Ra, in some governments, since he can't predict what sort of ruler will come next and whether or not he'll hold the same beliefs. So it doesn't matter how wise you are, there's no guarantee that the next person who comes along, the next regime that's going to come in power, is going to be favorable to you. And that weighs heavily on a person. The more powerful a ruler is, the less powerful we are. And verse 6 says, "To every purpose there is time and judgment." But that word purpose is actually pleasure. So literally this reads, "There is a time and a law for every pleasure." In other words, whatever your political position may be, conservative, progressive, Democrat, Republican, whatever you consider yourself, if you wait long enough, there will be government in your lifetime that's going to be in your favor. And this is even more prevalent in our dynamic government that constantly shifts in power. But even in the ancient world, if you lived long enough, you would see several rulers come and go. And more than likely, some would line up with your beliefs and some wouldn't. If you want to live long, politics probably isn't the field for you, especially in the ancient world. It usually ended in bloodshed as the next regime came in and implemented different policies. Now, a couple of scholars have noted similarities here to some lesser-known proverbs of Ahikar. We talked about the proverbs of Ahikar a couple weeks ago. It's an ancient Mesopotamian text, probably around the same time that Ecclesiastes would have been edited together. And if you get into the proverbs of Ahikar, you're going to find it's a mess. There's all different translations. The numbering of the proverbs is different, so there's very little agreement. And these are a little bit more obscure ones that you're not just going to find on a basic internet search. But the proverbs of Ahikar, and that can be Ahikar, sometimes it's Qar, sometimes it's even spelled a little bit differently, but that's the general idea. Fascinating text. I was reading through it for this study, and I definitely recommend searching into it and reading some of them. You'll be surprised the similarities you find to familiar Bible texts. But anyway, yeah, a couple of scholars have quoted here some of these proverbs of Ahikar that seem to relate to what Qoheleth is saying. It reads, "Do not suppress the word of a king. Let it be healing for your heart. A king's speech is soft, yet it's sharper and mightier than a two-edged knife. Here is a difficult thing for you. Don't stand against the face of a king. His rage is swifter than lightning. As for you, guard yourself. Don't let him show it because of your speech, lest you die before your time. See the good of a king. If something is commanded to you, it's a burning fire. Hurry, do it. Don't let it be kindled against you, and don't sit on your hands. Moreover, the word of the king is as the delight of the heart. Can wood contend with fire, flesh with knife, or man with king?" So you can definitely see some similarities there. Verse 7, "For he doesn't know what will be, or who can tell him when it will be." Basically, no matter how much someone claims to know, none of us actually knows none. Verse 8, you'll get some translations that will say wind here. There's no one that has power over wind, and that's because that's that word ruach, so it can mean wind, it can mean spirit, depending on the context. But I think it does fit with the idea of breath best here, and that's kind of where you get the idea of a person's spirit, because if you stop breathing, your spirit leaves the body, as they would say. So Murphy, in the Word Biblical Commentary, says there are 4 following examples that have in common this fact. They escape control and manipulation: ruach, day of death, war, and wickedness. So these are the 4 things that doesn't matter who you are, you ain't escaping them. One is breath, or spirit. You can't escape your breath. Even if you try to hold your breath, eventually your body is going to force you to breathe. And one day you will breathe your last. And with that comes the second thing, the day of death. No one is able to cheat it. We all end up in death's grip. Third, war. And some commentators take this to mean being conscripted into war. Throughout most of human history, if you were a young adult male, you probably ended up in the army. And that's possible, but I think it's more likely that he's talking about just war in general. Throughout most of human history, most civilizations fought. You weren't going to go a lifetime without having some major war that your people were involved in. And, right now we're at a relative time of peace in the world. Obviously, there's conflicts all around, but compared to a lot of human history, it's not nearly as prolific as it has been. So we might be at a point here where we've actually avoided a little bit of war, but even then, we still have it going on. And then lastly, wickedness. And with that, we have to ask, is he talking about wickedness happening to you, or your own wickedness catching up with you? As we look at this verse, we see it says there is no discharge in that war. And that discharge is saying there's no escaping it. There's no dispatch from that war. Somebody gets an honorable discharge from the service. So, it's saying that sort of thing. But what is that war? Well, some scholars think that is the war against death that we have all been involuntarily drafted into. And that's interesting because even though there's nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible where death is depicted as this battle, it is an idea that is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And specifically, one part that says, "The battle that cannot be fled has caught up with you." And that's quoting from Jones's Qoheleth's Courtly Wisdom again. So that's a very poetic option, and I like that idea. Some translations present "neither shall wickedness deliver those who are given to it" as saying that our own wrongdoing weighs heavily on the conscience. But I think it actually echoes the wisdom of the previous chapter in that cutting corners morally does not provide you any true advantages in life. We talked last week about how you can't get ahead in life by being the bestest or the baddest. Neither one is a golden ticket guarantee to escaping the hevel of life. Verse 9, "All this I have seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man rules over another to his own hurt." Well, it's possible that the man here is the king, again, since he's been the focus so far. It's also possible that it's saying we all hold power over our fellow humans to heal or to afflict. This one's a little tough to translate because it literally reads, "where the man rules over the man to his evil." And as you can tell, that's not great English. Where the man rules over the man to his evil. And the idea of evil is someone being hurt there, somebody being abused, somebody getting the short end of the stick. So we have to ask, who is being hurt here? And is it the person who is doing the hurting? Or is it the person that they are hurting? See, when it says one man rules over another man to his hurt, it does not say to his own hurt like the King James has. It's a possible translation, but that doesn't have to be it. The King James translators were showing a little bit of interpretive bias, tipping their hands there, saying that abusing someone else, oppressing someone else with your own power and misusing it, that is going to come back to bite you in the end. It's going to actually end up hurting you. That's a very possible interpretation, but it could also just be talking about the ways that you are hurting the people under you. And I think this is a really good question for us to ponder. Like, whenever we use power over other human beings for our own advantage, are we just shortchanging them, or perhaps ourselves as well? Brown observes, "Having effectively severed all meaningful connection between toil and profit, Qoheleth makes painfully clear that gain, or hope for gain, is incapable of rendering work meaningful. Rather, it is the balance between toil and play, between labor and rest, that makes for satisfying work. The joy he commends, however, is more than an antidote to toil, since Qoheleth finds enjoyment and intrinsic value in work itself." End quote. Okay, we are actually going to stop here for this week. Originally, I was planning to do the whole chapter, but the more I've considered what we've been talking about so far, there's a lot here. There's just so many different directions that this chapter can go based on a few interpretive choices you make that I think we just need some time to step back, consider some of these possibilities. And then next week, when we come back in, we're going to see Qoheleth's answer to all of this. He's been talking about being in a position under someone else who has more power than you. And that's something we can all relate to, right? Even if you're a high-ranking person in your line of work, chances are you have a boss over you. And even if you're the CEO of a company, you still have people over you in other situations, even if it's just government. So we can all relate to being low man on some totem pole, no matter how high up a different totem pole we may be. And so Qoheleth has kind of been setting the stage there. And then in the second half, he's going to talk about a response when that power is abused, and then also a way to get around the rat race of trying to climb the power ladder. While there's definitely some more textual complexities that we'll cover in those verses, it's a very practical message, even for us 2,000 years later. So I'm looking forward to getting in that with you next week. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.